The other reason for such a short drop to the sinker is that when you go to reel in, you have a more direct connection with your sinker. So when you go to lift that sinker up off the bottom, that sinker is going to come straight up and out of the rocks. You've got a far better chance of lifting that sinker up off the bottom with a short trace than if you had a long one. Another reason why you should always use a fixed rig in the rocks and not a sliding rig. You imagine if this sinker is snagged when you hook a fish, you're just going to play that fish. If you have a sliding rig, you're going to play that fish backwards and forwards through that sliding rig. Okay, until you finally get the fish back to this point. You know, fixed rig is the way to go. You don't want to be playing a fish through a swivel or a ring with a sliding rig in the rocks. It's just a recipe for bloody disaster. There's a couple of other points I'd like to make when it comes to fishing off the rocks that will help you minimise your gear loss. As I mentioned before, it's typically your sinker that gets snagged. So my number one bit of advice is once you've cast and once your sinker is settled on the bottom, do not move it. This is where you need to tend your line. If you're not already snagged once that sinker is settled, and it's possible you are, but the worst thing you can do is pull back on your rod to check whether you're snagged or not, because if you're not, the chances are you will be after you finish doing that, because all you're going to do is drag that sinker along the bottom until it finds a nice little hole in between some rocks to fall into, and then you're stuck. The other thing I do when I'm fishing is I always hold my rod. Now look, there are guys on here who are very successful fishing off the rocks in a pair of red bands and out of a rod spike. So please yourself. Me, I like to wear a wetsuit. I'm prepared to get wet. I'm prepared to wade to a handy rock to cast and fish from. And I'm always conscious about keeping my rod high and tending my line. I'm carefully reeling up slack, so I'm not shifting my sinker at all, but I'm in touch with the end of my line. And what that means is that I can keep my line out of any weed band that's in front of me. You don't want to get stuck in the weed if you can help it. You want to keep your line from settling in amongst a heap of rocks, and I'll explain why in a minute. It means you can react quickly if you get a strike, and you're in control of that fish very quickly, because if it's a good fish and it sticks its head down, it's going for it, you need to be able to try and control it and keep that line high and up out of the rocks. The other thing is sometimes you'll be fishing across a wave break, and so as that wave comes through and hits my line and starts to drag my line and therefore my sinker, I just drop my rod with the swell to compensate so that that wave action isn't dragging my sinker around and then snagging me again. Leon once said to me that the biggest threat to losing a fish once you'd hooked one were limpets. Now you think about it, your line is going around a boulder with a fish on the end, and the line slides up that boulder. On that boulder are dozens of limpets. You know what a limpet is? You should do. That line slides up and then goes under a limpet, because remember that line's under pressure, so it's hard onto the rock. It slides up and hits a limpet and slides under the limpet. What does the limpet do? It clamps down. And you know how thin and sharp the edge of a limpet shell is? That'll just cut through your line like a knife. The last comment I'd like to make for now is bait. Snapper are pigs, and especially big snapper. If you see what they have in them, starfish, these little spongy anemone things, I'm still not sure what they are exactly, pawa obviously, crabs, kinna, and especially when there's been a bit of a rough sea and the stuff is floating around, you know, they're in there smashing it really. Octopus or squid, octopus being the number one. It's durable, it won't get picked off. You know, it's not unusual for me to fish a whole session and only cast 2 or 3 times the whole session, so I don't want to be trying to reel in and check my bait, because if I get hooked up I'm going to spend my whole session breaking off and retying and starting again. I don't want to be doing that. I want to be fishing. The longer my bait is soaking out there, the better. And you don't need to worry about soaking a bit of octopus for an hour. It's not going anywhere, and the snapper love it. The next bet, as I said, is squid. By all means, fish. Fish baits if you want, a chunk of kahawai or something like that. But they simply won't last. Spotties and kelpfish and all those things will just chew them apart pretty quickly in most cases. So that would be my recommendation. With the octopus, leave the suckers on it. The only thing I do is cut it into sort of pieces about the size of my finger. It doesn't have to be big. Remember, the bigger your bait, the more it cuts your casting distance down. And a 20-pound snapper will see that as an easy mouthful. So don't be afraid to use smaller baits. I will cut the loose skin along the spine of the tentacle off, but otherwise I'll leave it intact. Leave the suckers on, and the only other thing I might do to it is when I get into the really thick part of the tentacle, I might cut it in half lengthways. Look, thanks for listening. Hopefully I've added something of value to some of you, and hopefully helped Leon's legacy live on a little bit. He was a super guy, and certainly knew how to fish. So tight lines, spend some time out there and see how you get on, and I look forward to hearing about people's successes.